Two and a Half Admins, episode 180. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Alan.
And here we are again. And before we get started, you want to plug the BSD Can 2024 call for papers, Alan?
Yes. BSD Can 2024 is happening in the end of May. So it's May 31st to June 1st, plus the 2 days before that for tutorials if you're interested. But looking for submissions until February 12th for talks about BSD, networking, sysadmin, all that kind of stuff. BSD Can is the biggest and most fun conference of the year on the BSD stuff. So definitely worth checking out and looking forward to a bunch of interesting talks.
Right, well, link in the show notes as usual. In major gaffe, hacked Microsoft test account was assigned admin privileges.
Somebody at Microsoft has got to be feeling like the biggest prat imaginable, assuming they're actually still with Microsoft. I don't mean as in getting fired for this. I mean as in, this was a long dormant test account that was left the network security equivalent of chmod 777 and abandoned in a closet to rot. And, attackers eventually found it and they had a really, really great day. But when those kinds of things get discovered, frequently the person who made the mistake has long been gone anyway, especially at a company like Microsoft. Because, if you work in the small business world, you might be used to thinking of, a typical stint at a company being anywhere from, 5 to 10 years. Enterprises like Microsoft, you're averaging frequently more like maybe 2 to 5. If you're not like a rock star, kind of the whole point of a lot of modern software development practices, especially at enterprise scale, is to make sure that no individual really much matters. So you get more churn, and the odds that the person who did the bad thing is still around to, slap their pee-pee in the door for it decreases.
Yeah, and in an update, it turns out that Microsoft wasn't the only one hit by this. While looking into it, Microsoft's security team discovered that Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, or HPE, had been hacked back in May, but didn't discover it or contain it until December. It seems this compromise was via password spraying, so just guessing common passwords for common usernames, and managed to access a test account, which is normally restricted to a limited number of accounts with a low number of attempts to access each one. They reduced its malicious activity by conducting these attacks over distributed residential proxy infrastructure, so using lots of individual people's computers rather than all one obviously Russian IP address. And, we've seen that before, including in the SolarWinds supply chain attack and so on. But this attack carried out by a group that Microsoft has decided to call Midnight Blizzard. But by connecting to target from IP addresses with good reputations and that weren't going to be on a blacklist for having tried all these passwords on all these different domains, they managed to keep up the attack for longer.
There's no reason to doubt Microsoft when they say it was a password spray attack. I mean, the thing about password spray attacks are once you've been attacked with one, it's not hard to confirm in the logs. Oh, yeah, one or possibly tons of different IP addresses were trying to log into this particular set of credentials with, a whole string of different passwords till one of them got in. But I think that it's kind of interesting and points again to just the systemic level of this failure, that the password spray attack worked on the bogus, abandoned, ignored test account, which tells you that somebody not only created a test account with massive overprivileges, they used a stupid password for it that was either reused elsewhere or just so bloody obvious that, a simple dictionary attack got it. And I would bet that somebody probably reused one of their favorite personal passwords.
I'm guessing they used one of the ones off a very popular list of popular passwords, because that's what you do with test accounts, right?
Let's be clear here. If you have a favorite password you like to use on lots of sites, that password is almost certainly on those lists. It does not take long for some site to get hacked and dumped and your creds to end up on those lists, which is why Alan and I, are always harping on folks, do not reuse passwords. And I get that there are some exceptions, and there may be a site that comes along that you're just like, I have to create an account and I don't care. And if you're sure you don't care, well, you can consider the whole favorite password thing, understanding that what you're essentially doing, it's like taping a key to your front door right next to the lock. You should think of it that way. And there may be circumstances where you're like, yeah, I literally don't care to the point that I would rather like have a key on a chain dangling from a padlock, just to let people get through it. Sometimes that can be a valid choice, but you should understand what you're doing if you do that. You're saying, I don't give a crap about any security beyond the absolute most trivial here because I used a password that I've used other places.
Yeah, and that's the biggest thing there is while you might not care about the site you're signing up for right now using the common password, remember that that's the site that's going to expose that common password and screw you over on every other place you used it. And that's why you don't use the same password.
That's an excellent point and worth enumerating. The value of a single site that you use a favorite throwaway password on may be next to nothing. But at some point, you also have to keep an eye on what is the aggregate value of all the sites I've used this common throwaway password on. Because once an attacker starts password spraying, they're not just going to get you on one site, they're going to get you on pretty much the whole pool that you've done that on. It may take a little while, but that's really what's at stake, is every site you've used that password on.
Yeah, like in this case, we're talking about them using these proxies to appear to come from a bunch of different places. But if you're targeting someone specifically, if you've got the dumps from 10 different websites that have got hacked, and if you have accounts on 100 websites, at least 10 of those have been dumped somewhere, then especially if they can commonize, oh, look, this email address used these 3 different passwords. And now they can be like, okay, we're going to try that email address with each of those 3 passwords on all 100 of these sites and get into lots and lots of them. And then, especially if they can get into one of those that's the linchpin of some others, right? If they get your email address, then they can just reset the password on all the other sites you're in. Or in the case of this Microsoft attack, the test user had access to just read every person in the domain's email account. So they could reset the password of anybody they wanted, including deleting the password reset email afterwards so that it doesn't show up in the other person's inbox. Or, if they have admin, they can write mailflow rules that say, hey, if you get an email from passwordreset@somesite.com, forward it to my inbox instead of theirs. So it never arrives in theirs and they never get a notification on their phone. And then you've reset their passwords and you own their entire account. So yeah, I understand test accounts normally don't have 2FA, but if you're going to give it like super global admin privileges, it's not a test account. It's a super global admin account. And if it is a test account, it should probably have an expiration date. Almost all modern systems have the ability to say, this account will stop working after this long. And the best way to not forget about the test account is to set that date to be not very far in the future. Because if it's just for test, you can always extend the date after, but you can't go back and stop the account from working when the Russians are using it.
And if it's just for test, if it's on the public internet, you still can't give it a stupid password.
Yes.
It's one thing to very temporarily set up an account on, a trusted local network that is only accessible from the trusted local network with a very stupid password while you get things worked out, understanding that you're going to fix that before you go in production with it. But you can't even do that much if your test environment is publicly accessible from the internet. That's the show. You can't screw around if you're putting things out there on the public internet for literally the entire world to touch and poke and prod at. No stupid passwords, 2FA or not. You can't do that. You just can't.
Yeah. And basically, if you're leaving anything with a temporary password like that, you've set a trap for yourself. And you're going to feel the bite of that bear trap sooner or later. So just don't use unique passwords, even on the test accounts.
Pixel phones are broken again with critical storage permission bug. This is unbelievable that Google have allowed this to happen again.
Is it really? Is it that unbelievable in 2024 that a massive corporation released crappy code and a crappy fix that didn't fix the thing? Because I'm not finding it that hard to believe.
Yeah, sounds like just another day.
Yeah, we live in a world where everybody is connected to everything at all times, which means you never need to get it right. Fuck it. Ship it out the door. Make your manager happy. Make that deadline. Doesn't work? Well, you can do it again a second time.
It does seem to be related to the last one, where people who had multiple profiles set up ended up being locked out of their phone potentially completely. Some people in boot loops.
It very much appears to just be the same bug that was not completely fixed the first time. We still don't have all the information about this bug because essentially if we did, then it would be fixed already and it ain't fixed. For end users, it basically boils down to if you thought your problems were over, with multiple profile usage on Android, no, they very much are not. And the recommendation is still don't do that. If you've got them and they're working now, strongly consider disabling them because we're still not sure exactly what triggers the bug. But once you trigger it, yeah, your phone is essentially bricked.
What's interesting this time is that it was actually a Google Play system update, which isn't the OTA updates where you have to reboot your phone and everything. This is just a silent thing that happens in the background.
Right. Well, a lot of the reason that this got moved into the Google Play updates is because Google can put stuff in that model and say, well, it's not, the open source part of Android that we have to share with everybody. So there has been a big push in the last several years. Google has moved more and more of the core functionality into the Play system, which makes Android without Google a lot less useful. I mean, nobody from Google has reached out to me and said, hi, I'm a Google press representative, and I want to let you know that the reason we're doing this is to make core Android less useful so people are more dependent on the proprietary Google Play services. But I can't think of a whole lot of other reason for that either.
I think the one that I saw in the past, which was part of the reason I got a Pixel phone, was that my carrier would brand and customize the OTA updates to say their name and so on. And so I always got the updates later than everybody else because my carrier took a long time to do that. So having it come through the Play Store instead of as part of the OS meant that I could get those security updates without the carrier or, if you were buying a phone from a vendor who's taking Google's thing and then customizing it, that you're not having the same latency to get the updates there. But I expect the real reason is a lot closer to what Jim was saying than just carriers are slow.
We're picking a different point downstream of Google that Google is saying, no, you don't get to have any control over this. Screw you. You use the thing the way we want you to use it. The more charitable interpretation is Alan's, where you're saying, oh, well, Google wants to stop these OEMs from doing crappy things that hurt end users. But I doubt that Google has any more love for folks like Phelim that are determinedly using F-Droid and avoiding every Google-branded everything they possibly can on their Android device. And I think Google is very definitely not thrilled about most of the Android, but not really, things out there competing, like Amazon's Fire Sticks and whatever. The more they can make it to where you don't actually get to just make your own Android distribution. You either use Android the way we want you to or not. Well, it's bringing control back inside Google's walls. And I think that's really ultimately what it comes down to. I don't think Google sees a lot of difference between the OEMs and you as the end user. In either case, it's somebody outside Google's control, and they don't like that.
Well, in Amazon's case, they've decided or not because they're moving away from Android for their Fire Sticks now.
Well, because they've kind of had to, because see above.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think Amazon was just champing at the bit to reinvent everything. I think they were quite happy to just fork Android, and like most of the hard work is done. And yeah, we all know here, that's what open source is all about, right? But this very much looks to me just like a classic case of, open source company decides, you know what? F that open source stuff for the most part. It's inconvenient. It gets in the way of making money the way that we want to make money. And we're going to do our best to pick up our ball and go home. We took the early adopter open source advantage of everybody thinking that we were great. Remember the do no evil days? Oh, it's open source. I can trust it. And, then you build the base and then you start trying to abandon those open source ideals. It's just another instance of the attract, extract cycle. First you attract them, then you extract all the good stuff, then you've destroyed the value of the property, but you've extracted tons of value, so you just spin up something new that isn't tainted with your bad PR, and you do it all over again.
The other problem is Google's only kind of statement on this so far is we're looking into it, which doesn't give users much guidance on how they should deal with this in the meantime, especially if their phone doesn't work. Are there certain steps I should avoid taking to make sure I'm going to get all my stuff back? But also, what can I do in the meantime and still have access to my phone? And, really trying to avoid the problem. But trying to avoid the update doesn't help since, like Joe said, it's not an OTA update. It's the Google Play system updates, which happen pretty automatically or get mixed in with all the other app updates that happen on a regular basis without a reboot of the phone.
Ron Amadeo, who wrote the piece for Ars, suggests not rebooting your phone. if you haven't done it for a while, which I was tempted to do it just to try, but then I thought, actually, no, I don't want a phone that's broken.
Yeah. Also says disabling any extra profiles like your work profile or any other multi-user features sounds like a good idea if you can manage that. And then he has a link to some instructions.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to 2.5admins.com/support for details of how you can support us too. 2.5 Admins is part of the Late Night Linux family, which means that for $10 a month on Patreon, you get access to an RSS feed that contains all the Late Night Linux family shows without adverts like this. There's also an option to get just this show ad-free for $5 a month if you prefer. Some of the episodes are even released a day or so early for Patreon supporters. So, if you like what we do and can afford it, it would be great if you could support us at 2.5admins.com/support. ARSTechnica used in malware campaign with never-before-seen obfuscation.
Now, I will say, I think the never-before-seen is it's a bit of a stretch, but this was a really interesting attack. The long story short is this was one piece of a multi-stage attack that was clearly intended for very high-value targets. And the reason I say that is because stage one of this attack was seeded USB drives with malware on them. But the malware on the USB drive is unlikely to get detected as such because it doesn't do anything obviously bad. What it does is it begins checking an URL trying to look for the stage 2 payload. And the stage 2 payload, it's base64 encoded inside HTTP GET variables. Now, in the case of ARSTechnica, the HTTP GET variable was tacked on to a user profile image of just a rando user profile. So this is not something that anybody would see, and even if they did click into that user's profile, they would see the image displaying just fine. And even if they clicked the image, it would go through to the original image hosted at pure PNG. Again, just fine. But because that URL had an HTTP GET variable, and that's the kind where at the end of HTTP my site, my page, you've got question mark, and you see like variable 1 equals one thing, ampersand, variable 2 equals second thing, ampersand, so on down the lines. Those things are HTTP GET variables. You have set, variable 1 to equal thing 1 and, on down the line. So what the malware would do is it would fetch this URL from this page. I don't mean follow the URL. I mean literally just grab the contents of the link, and base64 encoded into an HTTP GET variable is where it actually needs to go to download stage 3 of the payload, which is the actual part that does the damage. Whether it's, exfil or providing a backdoor for the attacker to come in later, that part we don't know. But stage 3 is where the bad things really happen. So the interesting thing here is this was very difficult to detect because the initial USB-seeded thumb drives in the parking lot, your network detection is probably not going to find malware on them because it's something custom that does something quite innocuous. So it's not going to get triggered off of known signatures or off of known techniques. All the thing is doing is fetching a web page. The web page that it's fetching is from a very well-known and well-respected site. In this case, ARSTechnica. The same attackers also used Vimeo for either the same campaign or possibly another related one. So now your high-value target, and you know it's high value because you went to all the time and effort to buy a bunch of USB drives, load them up with malware, and then, seed them in parking lots. Like, you don't do that unless you're after somebody specific. So your high-value target gets it, takes it into work, plugs in the USB drive, gets the malware on their computer that looks innocuous so it doesn't get detected. The innocuous appearing malware goes to a user profile at ARSTechnica, which is not going to show up as anything at all strange by a either automated or like live human, InfoSec blue teams. Then it gets the base64 encoded URL from those GET variables, and then finally goes to the third site to get the actual malicious payload. So I thought this whole thing was pretty cool. And it was also interesting seeing the back and forth in the comments section because it was very clear that most people just really aren't quite following through the logic of how this would work and why you would do things in this order.
Hey, Alan, you've been around tech communities for a long time and you've gone to a lot of IRL meetups with people. Have you ever heard anyone else pronounce URL as URL?
No.
Okay, not just me then.
But I've heard lots of other ones pronounced that, and generally seems to be a consequence of learning a word by reading it and going, long enough without ever hearing another person say it that you've just come up with your own pronunciation. And it generally just means that the person is learned by reading, which is not a bad thing.
Also, in this case, it's a person who is well aware that most people say URL, but is like, screw that, one syllable. This is a thing that I have to talk about a lot. It's an URL, get used to it.
Fair enough.
To Jim's point about dispelling the misconceptions, the Mandiant researchers were clear to point out that just looking at this image isn't going to hurt you. It's just in the URL for the image, they've just encoded some information that when something that's actively looking for that information can use it to know where I'm hiding the next step. So it basically allows them to hide the shortcut to their command and control system or to their payload somewhere innocuous where they can even go in and edit it and change it, and nobody's going to notice that they changed the URL of their profile picture on ARSTechnica's forum, but that URL is actually providing instructions to all the infected machines on where to go get the next stage of the infection. Or like Jim said in the article, there was another one where basically in the description of a video on Vimeo, further down in the part that you have to click more to see, there's just one of these strings of gobbledygook in the description. So the malware just goes to Vimeo to that one video and looks at the description and says, oh, there's the URL to go get the secret next payload. We saw other versions of this that were called fast flux, where they would do something like this with an algorithm that would generate some random letters based on like a date. And so they would go and like register domains, knowing that, in 2 weeks from now, this malware will tick over to that date and it will come to this domain to get the next stage.
Huh.
And now the neat thing about this is you don't even have to bother registering the domain.
Mm-hmm.
I found this pretty interesting because Arich, the head moderator over at the Ars forums, he was kind of voluble about this. And he talked about how, we shouldn't have this problem again because I've locked down user profiles so that you can't view a user profile unless you're logged in. So now, random people who aren't logged into ARSTechnica, even if they have the stage 1 malware, they won't be able to, see the user profile that has the HTTP GET URL, it's just all this nonsense. And it's like, okay, but that actually doesn't accomplish anything because you could just as easily make a comment on a news article that, just has a 1 pixel transparent ping in it that's got the same deal. You encode the third stage URL in base64 and HTTP GET variables, and you won't be able to see it. You won't be able to see that there's an image there. Everything will just work. And then even beyond that, like, okay, well, maybe you just want to say, I'm going to disable images entirely. Well, that doesn't help either because you can create a link and you can actually control the display link text versus, where it goes to. So you could paste in, for example, a link to an article covering the same topic as an Ars news article from, let's just say, The Verge or CNET or whatever. And what you see on the screen is just the raw text of the URL, apparently, but the actual target, which you can put in using the forum software, is the raw URL plus those HTTP GET variables. So all you see is somebody helpfully linking to other coverage of the same article, unless you actually go through and go into a web dev console and look at it, at which point you'll see the real target is the same thing, but includes the extra GET variables. And you may actually have to open a web dev console because guess what happens if you mouse over it? Well, if you're using Chrome, it will helpfully truncate the URL to no more than, I think it's about 20 characters, which is not enough to get a typical news URL in there entirely. So again, you won't see the GET variables.
Even if you block HTML entirely, on the Vimeo case, they just put it as plain text in the description, as just some letters on the page.
Yeah. Now, the win there with doing it the way that they did it at Ars and not the way they did it at Vimeo is it's a lot harder to detect.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I was leading to is, Arch has been very vocal in that thread. And another one of the things that he said is he gets that he doesn't do InfoSec for a living, but he doesn't understand why somebody would want to use something at Ars where there is an active and, very technologically knowledgeable staff around that will detect and nerf such things. And, I was like, well, there are a few reasons for that. And one is that you didn't notice this until somebody tipped you off on it. And sure, when you did notice it, you nerfed it. But by that point, how many weeks or months had that been up? And stage 1, again, is USB thumb drives seated into a parking lot, which means that there's a very tight window on each one of those campaigns. You only need that second stage to be up for a couple of weeks max, at which point nobody's ever going to encounter it anymore. So this is not really an issue that somebody hosting the site where the second stage gets dropped can entirely fix. You can say, this is why we can't have nice things, and turn off every kind of image and, every kind of link and anything that a user can upload, and they can still put it in plain text, like Alan mentioned for the Vimeo, which that's more likely to get detected eventually. But honestly, even then, how many times do you see an obviously garbage link stay up on very well-trafficked, well-respected forums for weeks?
Yeah, or they could decide to do something more complicated than base64 encoding and encode it in what looks like a sentence of words or something. It just means they have to try harder. And once you take out all the easy ways, that's when they'll start trying harder.
Or they could use steganography to encode the URL into an actual image and upload the actual image. And if you didn't know the key, you would have no idea that there were a few extra bytes worth of information encoded into that JPEG of somebody's dog at home or whatever.
Right, or even a profile picture on the forum. Because I expect even when ours strips down access to profile pages to being logged in, people still want their profile picture to show up in the comments when people are reading the article. And some of that you can maybe negate some of the steganography by ours. When you upload a picture, they run it through, Image Magic or whatever and crunch it down a little bit and do enough stuff to it that it breaks the steganography. But that's a lot of extra effort for maybe stopping weird people from doing weird things every once in a while.
Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. And if you want to send any questions for Jim and Alan or your feedback, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Sam says, I have a Windows 10 desktop that is not Windows 11 compatible and will need replacing come October 2025. I'm worried that the prices are going to shoot up in the run-up to the Windows 10 end date when everyone realizes that they have months to sort their shit out. Do you advise upgrading hardware in good time, for example this year? My PC still has a good few years of life left in it, so ideally I'd leave it as late as possible to upgrade. Unfortunately, I need Adobe for work, so I'm stuck on Windows. You don't need to put that qualifier in, Sam. It's fine to run Windows if you want to. Just ask Alan.
Yep.
Well, it made sense for Sam to include that qualifier because it heads off any, just ditch Windows and install Linux, at the pass. And presumably Sam would love to do that from the way Sam said that. But, I need Windows. And I get that. Every time I use Windows, it's because I needed to, not because I wanted to.
Yeah.
So in this particular case, Sam had either a 6th or 7th generation CPU, which is not Windows 11 compatible and won't be.
Officially, at least.
Sure, not officially. You may or may not be able to hack your way into it, which I do not recommend, unless that's a thing that you just want to do on your own and deal with any problems that you encounter yourself, and that's part of the fun, in which case, knock yourself out. But I'm not going to give you any advice on it, because if you need advice, you shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
Before we get into the rest of it, I do want to point out that a lot of the folks who think their machines are not Windows 11 compatible, it may be more compatible than you think. One of the most common issues that prevents the Windows compatibility checker from saying, yep, you're good to go, is the lack of a TPM, a trusted platform module. With that said, most motherboards, they offer a software-based TPM. It just needs to be enabled. It's one of those bizarrely disabled by default options, kind of like most consumer motherboards have virtualization disabled by default for some freaking reason. You end up having to go in and turn it on. It's the same thing with the software TPM. So if the TPM is the reason you can't upgrade, be sure to go into your BIOS and look around for a software TPM option. It's very likely right there, and all you got to do is turn it on. As long as the virtual TPM it offers is version 1.2 or higher, you'll be good to go. Now, the other issue is, some of these older boards, they do offer a software TPM, but it's only version 1.0, and that will not suffice. Anyway, this wouldn't help Sam because Sam had a 6th or 7th gen processor, but my advice was there's probably not going to be a big run-up in the last months before the Windows 11 upgrade, but I would say go ahead and make that upgrade now anyway, because if you're still rocking a 6th or 7th gen processor, now, it might very well be good enough for you for another several years of use. However, when you go buy a new processor, you can actually go down a couple or three performance rungs, in your preferred vendor's hierarchy of performance and still just absolutely wipe the deck with that old 6th or 7th gen CPU. I mean, we're talking going from an i7 down to an i5 or an i3 and having, like a 30% single thread performance boost and like a 300 or 400% multi-thread boost in some cases. So if you're still rocking that 6th or 7th gen processor and you're like, should I go ahead and upgrade or should I wait? I would say just go ahead and do it. Enjoy it. You'll get a real benefit. This is not just a compliance upgrade.
Yeah, I think the two biggest things I would reinforce from what Jim said are, there's not going to be a rush for people to upgrade because half the people don't know about this magic 2025 date, right? If they're the type of people that are still running Windows 10 in 2025, they don't care what the date is and it's not going to make a difference to them. They're going to buy a new computer when they can or want to or whatever other forcing function happens. And so there's not going to be some run up because, oh no, if I don't upgrade, I'm going to be stuck on an unsupported version of Windows is not a thing people who don't work in IT even think about.
There might be a mild run on like corp refurbs. One of the best sources for cheap computing for home or for very small business is going and getting the relatively cheap corporate refurbs. They come off of a 2 or 3 year lease, so it's a practically new machine. The way most people would think about it, and you can grab it for anywhere from 2/3 to less than half the cost of the same hardware when it was brand new. Now there may be a bit of a run on those as you get closer to that Windows 11 EOL. But general parts availability, I'm not seeing it.
By October 2025, there'll probably be a bunch of those that are new enough that they have Windows 11 that'll be for sale.
Sure. What I'm saying is the prices on them are likely to shoot up because there probably will be a bit of a run on those, end of lease corporate refurbs. So I don't think it would be enough that you wouldn't be able to get one. But we saw the prices on those go way up during the pandemic, and we might see I don't think it would be anywhere near as big a version of that, but you're liable to see something similar in those last months in 2025. So if your plan is specifically grabbing a corporate refurb for cheap, then I would definitely advise doing that earlier. But if you're just going to build yourself a system, do it whenever you want to. But again, I would say do it now because holy crap, it's going to be so much better than what you're using.
Yeah, I didn't really have that settle into me until I was looking at it 6 months ago or so. My home file server is a dual socket Xeon V2. So it's technically, I think, 3rd generation, but whatever. It's 20 cores of 3 gigahertz. And I'm like, that's a massive machine. And then, look at the single and multi-threaded performance of like a mid-range Ryzen in one of those little for powering your TV boxes. And it's got as much CPU power for like $400 on Amazon. I'm like, oh, I think it is time to do a hardware refresh because I could get literally double the performance by catching up a dozen generations from where I am now.
And probably use way less power at the same time.
Or use the same amount of power to get a lot more out of it.
A lot more out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Right, well, we better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or your feedback. You can find me at jrs.com/mastodon.
You can find me at jrs-s.net/social.
And I'm at Alan Jude.
We'll see you next week.